It is us to thank you for being with us and sharing your thoughts and vision. And we continue this special new format of open panels with two more amazing participants who shall be challenging about data protection, security, and responsible AI topics. It's my pleasure to welcome Ivana Bartoletti, Global Chief Privacy Officer at WIPRO, WIPRO Technologies, and founder at Women Leading at AI Network, and Andrew Sullivan, President and CEO, Internet Society, ISOC, along with Amit, Pradhan, President, Silicon Valley Blockchain Society. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours. Please present yourselves, and we look forward to hear from you.
It's really great to be here with you. My name is Ivana Bartoletti. I am the Global Chief Privacy Officer for WIPRO Technologies and the founder of an organization called Women Leading Artificial Intelligence. And I'm also a visiting policy fellow at the University of Oxford, at the Oxford Internet Institute, where I focus on issues around data transfers and potential new mechanisms to avoid data protectionism. My day job and my focus is on privacy by design, heading up the privacy function of WIPRO, and acting as a product counsel on all the sort of new technological products that we put out in the market. Andrew.
Thanks, Ivana. My name is Andrew Sullivan. I'm the president and CEO of the Internet Society. The Internet Society is just turning 30, so we've been around for 30 years trying to protect and defend and promote the internet and the way it works. Amit.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for the work you've done for such a long time. So I'm Amit Pradhan. I'm the president of the Silicon Valley Blockchain Society, and also the chairman of Rainfall, which is a data self-sovereignty and privacy-based monetization platform. I've been involved in the work of privacy-based AI for the last 16 years, and a lot of my work has been around the concepts of how we can create self-sovereignty and privacy in data, and the way that we think about the responsibility that we have from a technology perspective to the privacy, agency, and rights of human beings around the world. It's a pleasure to be here. And Andrew, if you don't mind, I'm going to start by asking you a first overarching question. You've been working to largely redefine the values of, an open, trusted internet for everyone for 30 years. How do you achieve this?
Well, it used to be easy, I think, because we used to live in a world where if you asked people, do you want a connection to the internet, they would automatically say yes. That everybody thought that the internet was just obviously a good thing, and you should, attach to it as much as you possibly can. And the world has changed. A number of unhappy events in the world have made people quite suspicious of this technology, and they have focused on the technology itself rather than the sort of social and legal and political environment in which this technology operates. And so one of our concerns is that there's been a tendency towards regulation of the fundamental infrastructure that underlies the internet, instead of addressing the sort of social and political and economic concerns that are happening. And so what we have been advocating lately is to do what we call an internet impact assessment. So when you look at if you look at a proposed regulation or whatever, just like, when you propose to build a dam or a road or an airport or whatever, we do environmental impact assessments, we do traffic impact assessments, we do social impact assessments, what are the noise and quality of life concerns and so on, because we want to figure out, okay, how does this fit into the rest of the things that we're doing? And so we are advocating for a very similar approach, an internet impact assessment, which looks at how does this action, how does this regulation, how does this thing that somebody wants to do, how does it affect the fundamentals of the internet? You know, the internet is in one way extraordinarily resilient. It's designed to be a reliable system built out of unreliable parts. And yet it depends on sort of a general consensus around, yes, we're going to operate that way. And if you start instead operating it in a kind of command and control fashion or something like that, that is dangerous to the fundamental principles and technologies that underlie the internet. So that's the way that we're trying to approach this these days, to, you know, get people to do these impact assessments on the things that they want to do. And I think it's an exciting opportunity, but it's a challenge because it's really hard to do those kinds of assessments. You know, and I would be really interested to see what others who are working in the regulatory areas or in you know, deploying new products or whatever, what, you know, whether this seems like a tantalizing opportunity, and whether it seems like a technique that could be useful in, you know, in all of your activities in your, you know, day-to-day lives.
Andrew, if I may, just to unpack that a bit, right? Like, is there an opportunity to sort of, if you draw the parallel to the decentralized world and the idea of smart contracts, is there a way to automate policy around these principles? Because I think, like, to some extent, there's the concept of the first principles, right? And in many ways, you're helping define those first principles. But it's like first principles for the internet is almost like the base level, right? So if we're thinking of first principles for, you know, data privacy, or, you know, first principles when it comes to, you know, cryptocurrencies, they all have to inherit from really foundational first principles of the internet, right? And if those can be codified in some way, then you take a lot of the friction out of the process of what you described, of like, hey, let's go through this assessment of what you want to build, how you're going to build, what is the intentionality, do you have a governance model to go with it, do you have an architectural model to go with it?
I think that's right. I mean, I was intrigued by what Ivana was saying about privacy by design, because I think this is a really fundamental part of what we're talking about. That if you look at, you know, the way that the internet depends on common protocols that are used voluntarily by all of the participants, then, you know, that is kind of inimical to the approach of saying, okay, well, this is what the regulation is going to be, so you're going to have to build that into your fundamental infrastructure. Maybe that fundamental infrastructure then becomes incompatible with some things that people want to do with it. And I know that this is an interesting challenge in privacy by design, and maybe I turn that to you, Ivana, and say, okay, well, does that seem like a tool that helps you in those efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I was really fascinated by the sort of conversations that you were having. And before I come to that, I just wanted to say something, Andrew. You mentioned, you started sort of talking about the mission of the sort of your work, and incredible, you know, that it's been going for 30 years is great. And I do wonder, you know, and I just wanted to share a feeling that I had when you were talking, and that is that it's interesting how, you know, when the internet was born, to an extent, you know, there was this sense that we were all going to be globally connected, brothers and sisters across the globe, this incredible, positive, progressive image. And then, you know, when we look at the reality now, what we've seen is a very different picture. What we see is some of the most disconcerting things have probably happened over the last few years that have driven people away from technology now to an extent. And this is a real shame. But they have been happening because of how wild that is allowed to become. So, I mean, if I think about how long it's taken to put in place in Europe, you know, to put in place something like the General Data Protection Regulation with all the problems that it has, with the fact that, you know, certainly not a perfect piece of legislation, arguably none, there can't be a piece of legislation which is perfect with the fast pace of technology these days. But what I find intriguing is, you know, is how things have changed over the last few years, you know, and decades, in terms of the hatred, the echo chambers, the violence, the all things that companies are started to take action about, and we can argue whether they're doing it efficiently or not. In a situation, in a context where I feel right now, sort of privacy is very much not a standing alone area, as in terms of, to me, issues around competition, antitrust, and consumer law, they have to be intertwined with privacy. We can't challenge the sort of champion privacy without asking fundamental questions around antitrust, in my view. And I just, by looking at the original promise of the web, and the fact that I'm sure that for some of the pioneers and for some people, startups, and this promise is still there. But I do think that I have some. I feel slightly concerned about how. I'm a very passionate about technology. I love technology, and I'm always looking for the latest thing that I could try. But exactly for that reason, I'm concerned about how people have been driven away and how their trust has been eroded over recent times. And I do feel, I can see what a lot of companies are doing. They understand this, they do, and they understand that it's also a competitive edge to try and regain their trust that is gone, and it's not a good thing. Just today, the final test was agreed of the Digital Governance Act in the EU, which is an interesting, all round, a very interesting piece of legislation, incredibly for the EU times, how quickly that was agreed. It's just like, whoa, that was so rapid. But, it does include things like data generosity, the fact that, there is something around donating data as a public value, not as something that, something that you own individually. And then, I know that Amit and I on this will probably disagree, but, not something that you can monetize on, but something that is part of you and you can generously give as a public collective value. But also interesting things about data intermediaries. And the reason why I'm saying all this is because there is an effort out there. And I wonder what you both think. There is an effort out there to kind of reverse some of this damage. But I do wonder whether, is it too late? And also, are we going in the right direction? Is that something that, we're not taking into account? Or, is this the right direction of travel? I do think that the European AI Act, with all the limitations, no, nothing is perfect, but does try to limit, for example, some of the harms. We live in a world of micro-targeting and digital advertising, which is really dangerous, and in my view, and I can see, for example, the UK, the Information Commissioner said to the ad tech sector, hey, that is not compliant. There's an issue with enforcement. But these are all conversations that we need to have, but it's really interesting to see the reactions out there, not just from regulators, not just from policymakers, but also from people. There is a demand for privacy that I haven't seen before.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I completely agree, Ivana. And I would say, I maybe come in on that uber optimistic side of this equation, where I believe that, and Andrew, I'd love to get your insight on this. I think for something that is so foundational to modern society like the internet, you just need to have 5% of bad acts, and whatever that means in terms of bad actors, for what is a 95% greater good, to lose the narrative battle, right? Most of the time, 5% of the actual content ends up consuming 95% of the narrative oxygen in most rooms, right? It's the same with AI. If you ask my 75-year-old mom, oh, she's going to hate me for this, 72-year-old mom,
you're finished.
I'm finished.
You're finished. That's the end. That happened to me.
Exactly. We'll edit this part out. No, but you ask her about AI, and she's going to make in spite of having, two kids who've been involved in the world of AI for 25 years now, she's going to make references to one of 10 Hollywood movies, right? And Hollywood AI kind of ends up consuming 95% of the oxygen narrative
For sure.
of the AI conversation, but not even 2% of where the money actually goes, where the best, minds are working, right? But I think what's really interesting, and again, this is like maybe taking a philosophical step back a bit. One of the reasons why I'm more optimistic is I like to spend a lot of time not trying to identify trends or merely participate in trends, but to try and tap into the tea leaves, the social cultural tea leaves, the zeitgeist, so to speak. And if you look at the last 6 really influential events of the last 5 years of our lives, the massive growth of Black Lives Matter, the climate revolution suddenly starting to become the face of a 16-year-old Swedish girl rather than, folks at the UN. We had Wall Street bets, right? And all these 3 are protest movements that are protesting, racial injustice that then evolved into gender and, take your pick. You had, a climate revolution that has become a generational protest movement. Wall Street bets was a protest against, like this insider trading model that, the average person doesn't get to play with. And then you have 3 other events, right? Bitcoin, a protest against, centralized currencies. DeFi, decentralized finance, a protest against, cabal-like centralized finance. And now we're seeing this crazy rush of NFTs, right? And NFTs are largely a protest movement around, a creator economy. If you don't get into, a gallery, how do you get your art out? And, NFTs are here to resolve that. And from an investment side, right, you can invest $30, $100, $1,000 into art that has value that is important to you. It could be LGBTQ plus, it could be, race and gender, it could be regional, it could be indigenous artists. What's really interesting is that the first 3 are protest movements. The second 3 are protest movements with the solution baked in. But in reality, all 6 of these are separate vectors of the same revolution. I call it the commons revolution, right? The people's revolution. And that's what makes me really optimistic, because this battle for privacy, this battle for, decentralization and democratization of money and equality and access on the internet, and everything that we talk about in different aspects of, what we use as our reference points, is starting to happen as a socio-cultural movement. And, I think the large tech companies are seeing that, perhaps not as well as they should. But, being in the decentralized world as I am, obviously doing Rainfall as well, the number of people and projects that I am constantly seeing that are tapping into this zeitgeist, the commons revolution, and designing for the commons with, privacy baked in, with democratization and access baked in, with fairness of economic policy baked in. And then reaching to these points of, the concepts of the DAOs, the decentralized autonomous organizations, taking it to that point of governance. Because Ivana, I would say to what, your point, I think we're having more than anything else in society, a crisis of fidelity, because we don't trust the data, we don't trust the information that comes our way. It doesn't matter if you're telling the truth or not, that's irrelevant, right? And until we can come up with governance models that can reinstill trust back into the commons, then talking just about tech or talking about a particular policy or talking about, a particular trend line will not help us solve this at a broader level. Because, just the final point on this is that we say privacy, and it's possible that, Andrew, you and I think of privacy in the same way. But, when I'll get this right this time, when my 77-year-old dad takes a photo of of, let's say, a BMW, knowing that, you know, I'm involved with the company, you know, sees this new BMW, he takes a photo, and the question that goes to his mind is, how do I send this to Amit? When we're out at dinner and we take the selfie of all of us eating, I'm about to post to Facebook. Yes, I am that old. The thought that goes through my mind is, who shouldn't see this? Who did I not tell that I was going to be in Zurich this week, and therefore let me exclude them from who sees this photo? But when a 17-year-old
Telling us
takes
a lot there, Amit.
when a 17-year-old takes a photo, you know what she thinks? What if someone doesn't see this? And my point being that all three questions are all examples of privacy.
I think there is a reason to be optimistic that we should keep in mind. And that is, in fact, the very thing that we're doing right now. So I am, since we're talking about ages, I am 52. And when I was growing up, this was total science fiction. This was like, calling somebody was an expensive proposition. We used to have this elaborate ritual that we had when we got to a long distance place where you'd call and you'd, you know, make a long distance call from some name that told the person at the other end they could refuse the charges. And I mean, this was just a well-known sort of thing. It's absurd to think of this now, right? You're never not in touch with people, at least the half of the world like us that have this connectivity. Of course, half the world, or almost half the world, still doesn't have any connectivity at all, which is the first problem that we have in terms of building this sort of trustworthy environment. But the second thing, I do think there's this point that we lose these, particularly policymakers now swim in the world where this connectivity is always there. And so they just take it for granted. Yeah. And do not think about, oh, well, this is practically a miracle that we have this marvelous technology and we better look after it. We'd better preserve it and maintain it. Just as, you know, for you know, more than a century, we looked at the ocean and we said, it's so big, we'll just dump stuff in there. And like, you know, one day you wake up and there's a giant pile of garbage in the middle of the Pacific and you think, maybe we should stop doing that. So this is the sort of the sort of social fact that is just true about us, right? Once you have this environment that you're living in, it becomes normal. And now all you do is focus on the negative consequences of that thing and you start to try to address it. And I mean, I think it's a normal thing. I think it's appropriate that we try to address negative consequences. But I do think that we need to be very attentive to the fact that, you know, without the internet, for instance, this pandemic would have been a whole lot harder to live through. And without the internet, there would be things that would be much harder. I remember banking when I was growing up, right? You had to go between 10 and 3 in the weekday. And that was like when you could do banking. You know, who had the time? Well, it turns out like the whole world just like arranged itself around bankers' hours. That's no longer a thing that we have to do. And I think that those are, you know, prosaic examples of things that are advantages.
I mean, I think you're right. And I think, you know, if there is something that's come up during this pandemic is really, I mean, how much two things, how much we rely on technologies, but also, and on the internet, but also what also has become really relevant and mainstream, I think, is issues around how, again, going back to antitrust and competition, how some of these big companies, they've become infrastructure. You know, I mean, this digital companies, the big ones, you know, how they've become infrastructure. They've been the ones supporting in alliance with governments, supporting us, be it the digital tracing or be it the online deliveries for shopping, whatever it is. And this needs to, and I think, you know, I think we need to stop and interrogate ourselves on, and I'm pleased to see what the FTC is the new direction, for example, in the US of the FTC, Lina Khan and you know, and the new people that have been appointed, you know, even advisors like Meredith Whittaker, you know, who've played a role in showing some of the darker sides of these tech companies. And I do like the tech companies, not that I don't, but I think, you know, the fact that we're talking about this is not because we want to stop progress, or but the fact that we like it so much that we want this progress to be valuable for everyone, not just for a few set of people. I think one thing though, and I think we're missing a perspective there though, which is the fact that I think it's okay. It's great to say, well, yes, we benefited of tech. And we have to look at the risks and the harms and have the courage to mitigate them so that we can make things better. But I also think that this dividends of the digital, they've been distributed very unequally. Yeah. I think that the invaluable, amazing work that is being done by Joy Bullaway in the US, showcasing how facial recognition discriminates against women of color, people of color. The fact that we're dealing with algorithms having increasingly an allocative function, a curative function, a curating function, they curate what we see online. We've been worshipping data as some sort of neutral thing, and data is not neutral. Data is the mirror of society and represents society. If you just take that data and feed it into the machines, the algorithms are just going to replicate society as it is, which is not good, is it? We want to change it and make it better. So I do think that we are at the point where these issues are becoming mainstream. I mean, coded bias was featuring on Netflix. The issue around bias in AI, people were not talking about it, and now people know about this. I mean, we are in a situation where Amit, you mentioned some of the things that you were suggesting, say these things are big changes, so we've seen the Me Too movement, we've seen Black Lives Matter, we see the reality is that technology right now is not helping to stop those and to make this issue better, but it's actually doing the opposite. On the issues, for example, such as BLM and racial inequality, automated decision-making and algorithms, they're worsening the reality, not making it better. This is what we're seeing at the moment. We're still seeing AI discriminating, and in a way, the non-discrimination law is unable to capture this discrimination. We're still seeing adverts that pay less being advertised to women, and adverts that pay more to being advertised to men, and that is because of intrinsic inequality within data, because it's society. This is where I would argue that this is the time, and we're seeing this happening to an extent, for the law to come in. This is the time in the European Union with AI Act to say, AI, which is harmful, well, actually, no, thank you. We need conformity assessment. I mean, Frank Pasquale in the US is arguing, an amazing academic, is arguing for a distrust by design. So people should approach AI products with distrust, and then it's the AI product through its transparency that has to demonstrate that it does not discriminate. Do we have the courage to consider a licensing agencies? This is not to tap innovation, but this is to make sure that this innovation really benefits people. At the moment, we still don't have the guarantees for this. We still have products, from skin cancer, they're trained on white skin and they cannot recognize cancer on black skin. We still have representational harm happening for the way that our internet is micro-targeting individuals, and therefore really sending subliminal messages that do not do anything apart from reinforcing existing stereotypes and turning them into prejudice. So these are all things that can be addressed, but they require the strong political will to address them. And we are in a scenario at the moment where I do think that we're seeing this happen in the US. I mean, Biden has said we need a new sort of bill for rights in a digital age. The FTC is saying, is taking a very strong stand on these issues. Biden himself, just in recent days, said he's taking a strong stand on how to link human rights and civil movement and civil rights to the harms that can come from AI. The EU has put forward all of this. Digital. The UK just yesterday issued the first standards for algorithmic transparency in the public sector, which is, I think, very, very good. Even, countries like China, they have an privacy legislation, the PIPL, with an extreme focus on algorithms and the harm that those algorithms can have on individuals. So the shift is changing. I mean, to me, the shift is not so much onto sort of the desire to be away, or, you know, to privacy in a very more traditional individual sense. To me, the shift is actually that government and politics, they've been shielding away from too long from these topics. And now it is actually time to come back in and drive some positive change.
So so that's really interesting, right? Because it goes into the regulatory conversations. You know, we deal with this all the time in the blockchain crypto space with you know, with the SEC and the CFTC and FINRA and, you know, these agencies, and, you know, obviously with the legislators as well. I mean, I think it's an interesting question, which is, on one hand, you know, is largely government, centralized government as we have it right now in pretty much the entire world, best equipped to identify, forget even put in place legislation around privacy, around the responsible use of AI, around the white boxing of these algorithms the way they are right now, about thinking about, you know, bias, and whether there's a legislative model to it, or whether there is, you know, Andrew, going back to my first point to you, you know, can these best practices be codified so that they are much easier to implement? And then tying that with, you know, we see this all the time with governments trying to grapple with where, you know, the future of governance is going. And when you look at the future of governance in terms of consensus models in blockchains, or whether you look at it in terms of, you know, decentralized autonomous organization and participatory voting and access by communities, and you have to wonder, like, 10 years too late, are these the right leaders to be putting together legislation that is going to affect an industry that is already 10 years past that? I do question that, to be very honest. And I'm not an anti-government, you know, everything should be decentralized person at all. I really do wonder, because having dealt with a lot of these people in these positions, I'm astounded by both, on one hand, how not ignorant they are, because the world kind of thinks, oh my God, these people have no idea what's happening with the tech world. And at the same time, how utterly clueless they are about where we are at and where we're going. And they're going to legislate for the last decade, not for the next.
But regulation is always late. I mean, that's the nature of regulation.
Sure.
It has to be. If you make regulations for the future, what you do is you prevent the future from coming.
Yeah.
But I will point something out that I've been reflecting on over this period, when we've had a lot of people drawing attention. The Black Lives Matter movement has been drawing attention to these inequities. Women and gender activists have been pointing out, hey, this is discriminatory and there's no reason to do this. And I just know in my bones, when I was growing up, those things were true too. But the difference was nobody could tell you, because the gates were kept by people who owned everything. I mean, that's the reality, right? The people who owned the television or who owned the newspapers or whatever were of a common class. They were of the same people. And this isn't to criticize them. This is just to say, this is the fact of this sort of style of operating. And that's part of the reason, that's part of the reason I work at the Internet Society, because we work for this global and open, globally connected network, because then people can make their voices heard.
Sure.
Black Lives Matter could never have happened in a prior age, because it just wouldn't have got on the television.
On the television, yeah.
And I think that's that gives us reason to hope that actually we can do exactly what you were saying, Ivana, that we have the social pressure now to say, okay, we've got to do something about this. But I think what Amit is pointing out is a worry that I have, and that is precisely, and this is why we're in favor of these impact assessments, that what will happen is people will regulate this like it's one system that they can set the rules for. And what I am nervous about is, particularly since we see some very large incumbent corporations saying, yes, we need some regulation for this. When a large incumbent corporation comes and says, please regulate us, that is not an invitation for more players in the market, right? That is an invitation to set the rules such that the people who are in charge right now are the people who get to stay there. And that's a thing that makes me very nervous about this. So what I really like are the I mean, I have a lot of quibbles with the way the GDPR was implemented, but I think the principle was exactly right. This is the outcome we want. We're going to make the penalties such that it hurts when you violate this. And then you just let people work according to their interests. I think the transparency efforts are really good. Transparency efforts around what are you doing with your network? What are you doing with that software? What are you doing with this big platform that everybody has? And what are you doing with this data? I think that those are legitimate things. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is an implementation of that is very, very difficult, right? Transparency around data rules, for instance, that involve, a 36-page, end user license agreement. Well, nobody's ever going to read that. You need something that is reasonable. And in particular, I think what you need is an indicator that says, okay, we know this is sort of the baseline expectation. These are the ways that we're going to violate that expectation with your stuff. And this is a way of sort of explaining these things to people that I think is part of is part of the way forward. But the nice thing about it is that in an open internet, in an internet where we can in fact still exchange things freely and so on, and we're late in the day on this problem, right? This is a thing that is gradually getting enclosed. It's getting controlled by a few people, and that worries me. But we still have it. We still have the opportunity to insist, hey, look, these are the terms on which we, the people of the internet, are willing to engage with you on using this stuff. And that tendency within our culture, within the global culture, is the one that gives me hope around the possibility that we're going to maintain the internet for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I think on your first point, when you were saying when you were growing up, we just couldn't see those things, so now we do. And I think this is precisely the reason why we worry, though. Yeah. I mean, the reason why we worry is that we have taken so long to fight against some of these things. And now we worry that these things become automated and hardwired into the system, so they become much more difficult to challenge, much more difficult to identify. So the reason why we really concerned about, for example, predictive technologies, the idea that sort of you predict and you can allocate resources, or for example, to tackle violence based on some criteria, and you say that fragment or the segment of the population may be a risk, and that's where we need to invest or wrap some controls around them. To me, that is very concerning, because what we are doing is not just putting in place a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is the opposite of what life and hope and optimism should be about, but you're not evaluating what the impact of being predicted upon may be on people. Does it really help? I think, to be honest, that I feel that the main issue that we are having at the moment is the idea that automatically technology is the solution to things. And that really worries me, because I do. So, for example, this predictive technology stuff, well, you're actually using sort of bogus technology, because you can't predict people's lives, because life is made of encounters, bodies, love, you can't predict because you want to really hide issues around policies and lack of social policies and funds that should be there to address things. The reason why I'm saying this is because, we need to understand the priorities here. The priority to me is an open and functioning internet, where a space of people can get together and without turning into a space of hate and while of course keeping the speech, freedom of speech and everything, but but where we don't have to worry. At the same time, the idea that we use technologies to serve some of the greatest challenges of our societies that we have, including the pandemic. But what I think is the issue is that, is that we are kind of in this sort of adoration of any glamorous new piece of technology as this is going to replace policy. And I mean, I remember a conference in Beijing not long ago where a politician said to me, well, we won't even need politics. We'll have AI telling us what to do. And I was like, oh, goodness me. I mean, now, never more, now we need politics, honestly. And going to Amit, the decentralized, centralized, I'm a bit too old fashioned maybe, but I do believe in that this is a time where we do need, if not even national, I mean, I'm in desperate need, for example, on AI to supranational institutions. I mean, we're seeing the issue of data transfers. I mean, we are desperate for supranational institutions to tackle some of the problems that we're dealing with. And this is impossible in an age of nationalism, sovereignty, especially digital sovereignty, which is harmful for everyone. But to conclude, I wanted to say there is one thing that I think is not working, and that is the fact that at the moment, you are putting the citizen at the heart of everything, and the responsibility on the individual to having to fight off some of the mishandling of data. I mean, it's impossible, as Andy was saying, for any individual to go and read 20 pages of privacy notice. This is why I do think we have to start experimenting with new forms of data governance. For example, the idea of intermediaries, the ideas of data trust, the ideas of focusing on pre-market controls and checks rather than simply on random checks once the things are out and relying on somebody who reports any issues with. So, we do need to try and see, this consent model is really not working, is it? It's too much effort. I don't want to have necessarily the time and the knowledge to go through every single thing. I just want to know that the single thing is fair. That is what I would like to see. I just want an authority to say, stamp it and say, yes, that is fair. It's been checked. It's been audited. It can go. It can be used, so that I don't have to have the responsibility onto me all the time to have to check for the way that the data journeys happen, and which global supply chain is going to my data going to travel. And I mean, I think it's really we need to change that.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it comes down to a little bit around this idea of carrot versus stick, right? And I think the concern that I have with like constantly trying to find the supranational power that's going to come down and responsibly do what needs to be done in the interest of the internet and modern society on top of that is, show me a terrorist and I'll show you a one-time freedom fighter. And in fact, show me a terrorist and I'll show you somebody's freedom fighter, right? And this is always the challenge. As soon as we start like trying to legislate our way or regulate our way to, the world that we want to build, you have to start asking the questions, who's the we? And what are the incentives for that we? And I think history has proven that, and again, like not to make the case for any sort of, massive decentralization structures of DAOs, but you have to operate more around the carrot, I think, because the stick is not something that can be democratized. Carrots can be democratized, right? And so, like in many ways, like for me, a large part of the analysis, just taking AI, for instance. Yes, there is this big challenge when you deal with big tech, but most of where the building is happening around that is happening around entrepreneurs, startups, founders who are taking these frameworks that are inherently leaky in the way they think about privacy, architecturally flawed from that perspective, and then building out, industry around that, right? And for them to survive, for them to even get started, there is capital coming in and feeding that system. And if we started creating the right incentives for people to build around privacy frameworks, build in centralized governance models, transparent governance models that require community that is using the product to vote on any changes, to vote on modifications, to vote on what works, what doesn't work, I think we then stop depending entirely on that right government. Is it Trudeau? Is it Biden? No, is it, was it Merkel? Is it the people working on GDPR? As Andrew will suggest, it's a step in the right direction, deeply flawed, like democracy. And so, we have a huge opportunity, I think, to empower, going back to that idea of commons revolution. And people are building, incredible solutions to some of the bigger challenges. And if we can help them build with the right incentives, and by those incentives, I don't just mean monetary, I mean around privacy, I mean around, right first principles, then we stand a better chance. Andrew, I want to give you last word because we're down to, last 30 seconds.
Well, I don't know that I should have the last word, except to say thank you so much. This has been a delightful conversation from my point of view. So I really appreciate the time we took. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. We should continue maybe next time face to face.
Yeah.